Grace Miller and her daughter Lily thought they'd found love in the same man, until the shocking truth shattered their world, and a deadly plan was set in motion. What began as a twisted love triangle ended with one man dead in a freezer, and two women on trial for his murder. In 2019, the small town of Ashland, Oregon, nestled between forested hills and quiet streets, was known more for its Shakespeare festival than for crime. People left their doors unlocked. Neighbors knew each other by name, and nothing ever seemed to change. That's exactly how Grace Miller liked it. At 42, she had built a quiet life for herself and her 22-year-old daughter, Lily. Grace worked two jobs, one at the local library and the other as a part-time bookkeeper at a small law firm. Her life was busy but steady. Lily, on the other hand, was still trying to figure out what she wanted. She had dropped out of college the year before and was working at a bakery downtown, saving up for her own place. Everything shifted the day Daniel Cross walked into their world. He was unlike anyone the town had seen before. Tall, confident, well-dressed, with a dazzling smile and a voice that commanded attention. He said he was just passing through, looking for investment opportunities in rural real estate. People were intrigued. Grace first met him at a small business mixer hosted by the law firm where she worked. He spoke about land development, sustainable housing, and high-return portfolios, all in simple terms that made even the most skeptical listener believe in his vision. Grace found herself listening, even leaning in. He seemed to notice everything, her nervous laugh, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the cautious way she smiled. It was subtle, but deliberate. Within a week, Daniel began showing up more often, at the law firm, at the coffee shop near Grace's house, even at the library where she worked. He was persistent, but never pushy. Grace, who had been single for almost a decade, felt a part of herself awaken, one that had long been buried under responsibility and routine. He made her feel seen, valued, beautiful. Meanwhile, Lily encountered Daniel by chance. One rainy afternoon, she was struggling with bags of flour outside the bakery when he stopped to help her. He joked about chivalry not being dead and offered her an umbrella. At first, she brushed him off, but over the next few days, he returned to the bakery several times. He told her she reminded him of someone he once loved. She didn't know what that meant, but it stuck with her. She liked the way he looked at her, not like a girl still figuring things out, but like a woman with something to offer. By the end of the month, Daniel was seeing both women, Grace and Lily, without either of them knowing. He moved like a magician, switching masks and changing tones with precision. To Grace, he was the mature, grounded man ready to settle down. To Lily, he was a bold dreamer who promised escape from her small-town life. He crafted stories so carefully that no one questioned the gaps, the contradictions, or the vague answers. He said just enough to be trusted and not enough to be caught. But behind the charm, something darker was taking shape. For nearly 3 months, Daniel Cross lived a life of perfect deception. Every move he made was calculated. He kept a strict schedule, dividing his time between Grace and Lily with military precision. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, he claimed to be in Portland for business meetings, but he was actually with Lily, taking her on road trips, exploring mountain trails, and staying in cozy Airbnb rentals just outside of town. On the other days, he was with Grace, dining at upscale restaurants, visiting open houses for land he said he wanted to buy, and introducing her to people who claimed to be his business partners. In reality, None of them were who they said they were, and Daniel had paid them to play along. He kept 2 separate phones, one for each woman, and used fake names in his contacts so there'd be no confusion if someone happened to glance at his screen. He went as far as setting up 2 different bank accounts and altering the way he dressed depending on which version of himself he was playing. With Grace, he wore button-down shirts, spoke about retirement plans and real estate ventures. With Lily, it was hoodies, motorcycles, and dreams of moving to California to start an eco-tourism company. He convinced each woman that they were his only focus, his only future. The lies grew deeper when money entered the picture. Daniel told Grace that one of his business deals had hit a delay and he needed a short-term loan, just $15,000 to cover some paperwork and inspections. He promised to pay it back within 2 weeks and even showed her a fake bank statement with more than enough funds. She believed him. Shortly after, he told Lily a different story, that his savings were tied up in a crypto wallet and he couldn't access it for a few days. He asked for a small loan, $5,000, and said it would be their first investment together. She sent the money without hesitation. The amounts grew over time, and so did his excuses. By mid-December, Daniel had taken over $40,000 between the 2 of them. Neither Grace nor Lily suspected the truth, partly because he made them feel special, and partly because they didn't want to see the cracks forming. Both women had noticed odd behavior, late-night calls he wouldn't explain, vanishing for hours without notice, and inconsistent stories about his past. But he always found a way to explain things just enough to put their minds at ease. Then, 2 life-altering events happened almost back-to-back. First, Grace discovered she was pregnant. It was a shock, but she felt hopeful, believing it was a sign that her second chance at love and family was real. Just 2 weeks later, Lily also found out she was expecting. Confused and nervous, she kept it to herself, unsure of how Daniel would react, or how her mother would. Neither woman knew they were carrying the child of the same man, and neither had any idea just how far the betrayal would eventually go. The moment of truth came without warning. It was a cold January morning when Lily walked into the town clinic for her first prenatal appointment. She had told no one, not even her best friend, that she was pregnant. Her plan was to confirm everything first, then break the news to Daniel, and eventually to her mother. She wasn't sure how she'd say it, but she believed in him. He had told her they had a future, that she was his everything. As Lily stepped into the waiting room, her heart dropped. Sitting just across from her, flipping through a magazine, was her mother, Grace. And sitting beside her, with his arm casually draped across the back of her chair, was Daniel. For a second, Lily thought she was imagining it. Maybe it was someone else. Maybe she didn't see what she thought she saw. But when Daniel turned, locked eyes with her, and went pale, the illusion shattered. The room spun. All 3 froze, expressions changing from shock to confusion to horror in an instant. Grace looked between Lily and Daniel, trying to make sense of what was happening. Lily didn't speak. She simply turned around and walked out the door. That brief, chaotic moment tore apart everything Daniel had built. Grace confronted Daniel immediately. At first, he tried to deny it. Said Lily was just confused, that she was obsessed with him, that it was all a misunderstanding. But the evidence was impossible to ignore. Grace went home, logged into Lily's social media, and found photos she hadn't seen before. Her daughter smiling beside Daniel at a hiking trail, a matching bracelet he had given them both, text messages, bank transfers. The truth hit like a freight train. When Lily came home that night, there were no words exchanged, just silence, rage, and pain. Both women now knew they had been lied to, manipulated, used by the same man. Worse, both were pregnant by him. The betrayal was unspeakable, not just from Daniel, but from each other, even if unknowingly. The house they had shared for years turned into a battlefield of hurt. The very next day, Daniel vanished. His phones were disconnected. The email accounts he had used were deactivated. The black SUV he drove was gone. He had emptied both women's bank accounts of any remaining funds he had access to. No one in town had seen him leave, and no one knew where he went. He disappeared like a ghost, leaving behind a shattered mother and daughter and the wreckage of 2 lives he had deeply damaged. Shortly after his disappearance, Grace suffered a miscarriage. The stress and trauma had taken its toll. Her world collapsed further. Lily, devastated and lost, decided to keep her child but couldn't shake the overwhelming weight of shame and confusion. How had they fallen for the same man? How had none of them seen the truth? But what they didn't yet know was that Daniel had done this before. And next time, he wouldn't just disappear. He would end up dead. As winter turned to spring, the pain left behind by Daniel Cross still hung heavy over the Miller household. Grace quit one of her jobs, unable to face the daily routine that now reminded her of everything she had lost. Lily isolated herself, struggling through her pregnancy in silence. The once close bond between mother and daughter had become strained, the air thick with unspoken resentment, confusion, and guilt. They lived under the same roof, but it felt like 2 strangers sharing a space haunted by the same man. When Grace finally decided to file a report with the police for fraud and identity theft, she wasn't expecting much. She just wanted some kind of closure. But the investigation quickly uncovered more than anyone anticipated. The man who called himself Daniel Cross didn't exist, not legally at least. His driver's license was a fake, his bank accounts were under aliases, and his business dealings were nothing more than elaborate scams. Police traced his phone numbers and email accounts back to burner devices, registered under different names in different states. Whoever he was, this wasn't his first time disappearing. As detectives dug deeper, they started to piece together a trail of deception that stretched far beyond Oregon. In Nevada, there was a missing person case involving a woman who had been romantically involved with a man matching Daniel's description. She had loaned him money, told her friends she was planning to move in with him, and then vanished. In Arizona, another woman had filed a police report after being scammed out of her life savings. And in California, there was a restraining order filed by a woman who said a man named Daniel Carter, yet another alias, had threatened her when she tried to report him. The pattern was unmistakable. The most chilling discovery came from Nevada. A body had been found 2 years earlier in the desert, buried in a shallow grave. The victim had never been identified. The remains were too damaged to provide a match at the time, but now investigators had something to work with. Personal items found with the body matched those in photos posted by one of Daniel's former girlfriends. Though it wasn't conclusive, suspicion was growing that Daniel's crimes may have gone far beyond fraud. Grace and Lily were contacted by detectives and asked to provide more details, anything that could help. As they recounted the events, one thing became disturbingly clear. Daniel had a method. He found women who were vulnerable, often single, often isolated, and he mirrored exactly what they wanted. He said what they needed to hear. He gave them hope, then drained them emotionally, financially, and sometimes, it seemed, even physically. A week later, police issued a warrant for Daniel Cross, whoever he really was. They feared he might be preparing to strike again, or worse, that he had already done so. But there was one unexpected twist. They also began looking into Grace and Lily themselves. Their stories were compelling, but something didn't quite add up. Surveillance footage would soon reveal that they might not have been his last victims. They might have been his executioners. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place 6 months after Daniel Cross vanished. In a remote part of Idaho, a storage facility manager reported a unit that had been abandoned for months. The rent hadn't been paid, and the smell leaking from the door had become too strong to ignore. When police arrived to investigate, they broke the lock and opened the metal door to find what looked like the remnants of someone's double life. Inside were expensive clothes, fake IDs, and personal items from multiple women, purses, photo albums, journals. But in the far corner sat an industrial-sized freezer, sealed with 2 thick chains and a padlock. What lay inside would shock even seasoned investigators. When they forced the freezer open, the cold fog rolled out, revealing a body wrapped tightly in plastic. It was Daniel. He had been dead for months. The autopsy revealed he'd been stabbed more than 20 times. The wounds were chaotic, furious, made in rage. His fingerprints confirmed his identity, though the real name still remained unclear. What was clear, however, was that this man hadn't run. He hadn't disappeared. He'd been murdered and hidden in plain sight. The question was, who killed him? Detectives reviewed surveillance footage from nearby traffic cameras and the facility's own security system. 2 masked figures had been caught entering the unit late one night, just weeks after Daniel went missing. They wore hooded sweatshirts, gloves, and left no fingerprints. But their movements were telling. One had a slight limp, the other paused often, appearing winded. The timestamps, the height estimates, and eventually trace DNA found on the unit's lock pointed to one possibility. Grace and Lily. When confronted with the evidence, both women denied involvement. Grace claimed she hadn't seen Daniel since the clinic incident. Lily insisted she thought he had skipped town. But their alibis didn't hold. Investigators found receipts for tools purchased with Grace's credit card, duct tape, plastic, sheeting, heavy-duty gloves, all bought days before Daniel disappeared. GPS data from Lily's car placed her near the Idaho border around the same time. Piece by piece, the story began to unravel. At trial, the prosecution painted a brutal picture. Fueled by betrayal, heartbreak, and emotional devastation, Grace and Lily had allegedly lured Daniel back under the pretense of reconciliation. Once they had him alone, they killed him, then drove his body across state lines to hide it where no one would find it. The defense argued that it was self-defense, that Daniel had become violent when confronted, and the women feared for their lives. The jury wrestled with the conflicting narratives for days. In the end, the verdict was split. Grace was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Lily, who was believed to have played a lesser role, received 15 years. The child she had carried was born during her trial and placed into foster care. The town of Ashland would never forget the story. What started as a charming stranger sweeping 2 women off their feet had spiraled into fraud, manipulation, and a gruesome murder. Daniel Cross had built a life on lies, But in the end he was buried beneath the consequences of his own deceit.